Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 6th, 2011, and my guest is Todd Buchholz. His latest book is Rush, Why You Need and Love the Rat Race. Todd, welcome to EconTalk.
Good to be with you, Russ.
Todd, your book is a slap in the face to most self-help books, and it's a fascinating read, very contrarian. It could only have been written by an economist. And you start by attacking the idea that many people hold as a utopian ideal, which is we need to get back to the Garden of Eden or something like it. What's wrong with Eden?
Well, Eden was a great place, from what I've read, thousands of years ago. Of course, it was lush, and Adam and Eve didn't have to work, and the fruit was there for the pickings if you were willing to take a chance. But we can't go back there anymore. Humans have evolved since then. Our expectations have evolved. Our brains, our psychological makeup has evolved. And while Eden and paradise still has this captivating aspect to it that attracts people from throughout the world, throughout cultures, they may not call it Eden, but the same idea of some paradise, it's just not something we're going to find in our lives. And the idea of changing public policy in order to create Eden, in order to stomp out competition, strikes me as a pretty reckless way to run one's life or to run an economy.
But it's a very commonly held view, particularly among many economists, that competition's destructive, inequality is harmful, and the ideal, we may not get there, like you say, we may not literally be able to go back there, but that's what we ought to be striving for. And you don't even agree with that. There were simpler days not all that long ago. We could go back, just turn back the clock, not thousands of years, let's go back 100 years, 120 years ago. Life was simpler. There was no internet. No telemarketer was calling you to interrupt your dinner conversation with your family. You didn't have to worry about traffic on the freeway. But life expectancy was about 48 years of age. People didn't complain about traffic jams, but they complained that their children were dying of cholera. Yeah.
So we could scroll back the clock, I suppose, and think about a simpler day. But the fact is, given life expectancy differences, if we went back to simpler days, half of the population wouldn't be here; they'd be dead, and we'd have all sorts of other problems. So, the idea that simple is better, I think, is a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that's sold to us by yoga experts, Zen masters, as well as economists and psychologists.
Well, couldn't we say, I'm sympathetic to your view, but let me present the other side. Let's go back to 1900 without the cholera. So, for example, I know people who don't have televisions. I don't know too many people who don't have computers, but there are such people around the world. And the claim would be that these complexities of our life, whether it's a fancy car, whether it's this big plasma, big screen TV, these are illusions. They don't really create happiness. They are things that we are conditioned to purchase and desire. And when we lived in 1900 America, say, if we could get rid of the cholera and the smallpox and the flu, which we have the technological capability of embracing that stuff, we could say that's good, and let's just let's lead a simpler, slower life.
But look, at any time in history, we could have decided to flip the switch and say, you know what, life is good enough at this point. We've got enough progress. And I'm sure there are people, Luddites and others, at various points in history would have said that. But thank God Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 didn't decide to put the economy in a lockbox and say, you know what, enough progress. We now have some electricity and we've figured out, that germs cause diseases and so on. And we could have decided that's enough progress. But frankly, as I look back on history, I can't find any particular point where I would have been happy for people to say and agree enough progress. How about, I don't know, right before the Civil Rights Act in 1964, would that have been a good time? How about 1860? Would that have been a good time? So when looking back, we can't really identify any moment where we would agree things were much better, and let's freeze frame. And I don't think, other than sort of the intellectual exercise of saying, can we create 1905 but without cholera? I mean, that's an intellectual game, a what-if game we can play, but it's all bound up together. And that actually is one of the themes of Rush. You can't have the curing of cholera, and you can't have medicines to alleviate heart disease without also having the competition and the pharmaceutical companies and the laboratory rats and the laboratory scientists competing to get in there to get their patents. That's all bound up together, and you can't simply wish for the good stuff without also getting rid of the process, the competitive process that ultimately leads to these things that we appreciate and some of which we don't appreciate.
Yeah, obviously there are some downsides to progress or things that we wish we didn't have to deal with. But I guess the other thing to think about is that if you want, you can live in 1875 America if you choose to, and you could enjoy the benefits of many of the technological advances that we made. You could be selective about it. The Amish obviously have made a set of choices about which technologies they'll embrace and at what pace. Most people don't want that, though. And I think that's one of the themes of your book, that simpler life doesn't seem to make us, doesn't make most of us very happy.
No, and I think you make a very good point about the Amish and others, and the Shakers, had embraced their own simple life, which also included a lack of procreation, which I think, as I point out in the book, left them just with a lot of uncomfortable furniture and, no progeny afterwards. You could attempt those things, and God knows during the 60s and 70s there were plenty of experiments, plenty of socialistic communitarian experiments. And I'm not talking about the Soviet Union. I'm talking about small scale, Woodstock-like areas, and most of them ultimately broke up. I mean, you could look at the kibbutzim in Israel, which in some ways, which were successful in some ways, and many are still around, but most of all of them have morphed into something much more commercially minded, because they realize that after you've got more than a couple hundred people, it's awfully difficult to maintain a standard of living simply on the basis of everyone being charitable and communitarian to each other. It just doesn't work that way, and that's something Aristotle pointed out thousands of years ago, that in his idea, the city, the polis, should only be as large as to encompass those numbers of people that could hear the sound of the trumpet or the ram's horn or whatever sound they were making. Basically, if you were beyond that distance, you couldn't be in the community. And so, in his mind, you really couldn't have a working community once you got past a certain number of people. And the same is true of these sort of communitarian efforts.
Yeah, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Tel Aviv? I think would be the right.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's an interesting. The kibbutz is an interesting example because I think, as you point out, they were fairly successful initially. They struggled to keep the next generation and the generation after that eager to play by the same rules. And very much of the, I said as a joke, but I think as modern metropolitan life in Israel became what it is today, with a much, much higher standard of living instead of maybe a slightly higher standard of living, the ability to get young people to play by the rules of the kibbutz, the egalitarian rules, was much harder to do.
Well, and also the rules were rather authoritarian. Right? I mean, the rules of living in the community and the concept of the children would be raised in communal homes and so on. And obviously, this was different from a communist authoritarian regime where it's forced on people. Right. These were parents and folks that voluntarily wanted to do it. In my book, that's fine if they volunteered for it. But to try to keep those sorts of rules in place, became exceedingly difficult. As you point out, once the temptations or the pleasures or the conveniences outside of the kibbutz was made apparent, it was tougher to literally keep them down on the farm picking Jaffa oranges.
Yeah.
Instead of Jaffa oranges, they're now designing software for the CDMA devices in our phones.
Yeah, I once spent 2 or 3 weeks on a kibbutz in the Negev in the southern part of Israel, where it's extremely hot. We worked from 4 a.m. to about 11, put in a 7-hour day of sorts. And we did 2 things. We picked peaches, and we also, one of the tasks I did was to clean an irrigation tube that would get clogged from the dust, the dryness of the air. The dust would block the little irrigation holes on the tube that would run for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of yards. So every 18 inches, there'd be a little hole, and I'd take a pin and clean it out of its dust or dirt. And those 2 tasks were 2 of the most boring things I've ever done. It was not, we were making the desert bloom. That was the inspirational part. But taking a pin and cleaning a hole every 18 or 30 inches, whatever it was not really that exciting. And of course,
not a whole lot of creativity. Now, let me ask you, if you wanted to do it every 33 or every 12, were you given the latitude there?
Well, the creativity actually, which I also didn't particularly like, was when to leave a tree behind. When you picked the peaches, you didn't pick every peach because, of course, some were too high or weren't quite ripe, and it would be better to let someone come along later. And as an amateur, I found it challenging to know when to move on. I don't think the people who lived in the kibbutz year-round were very appreciative of the volunteers, which is what we were. We were pretty inept, I think. So we probably could have there was some room for improvement and mastery, but it was small, and I found it, as did many of my friends, a little bit challenging because it wasn't the most exciting work in the world. But so that raises, actually, I want to raise an interesting question. You talk a lot in the book about the power of creativity and innovation, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But not everybody has creative jobs. What about those folks?
Well, first of all, not everybody wants a creative job either. I have met plenty of people in my work life who really do want to come in at 9, be given a list of tasks they must accomplish, and they want to be able to go home, when the clock strikes 5. And they're not really interested in creativity. And, that's fine. I guess the question,
or at least on the
more
job.
Important from your point of view. What about those who do seek to demonstrate their creativity and do not have an outlet in their workplace? And certainly that's true. Look, as I say in the book, there are certainly plenty of people who have miserable jobs, miserable bosses. They may also have miserable home lives as well. But when you look at the data, and if you take the U.S. in particular, and ask, are you satisfied or very satisfied in your job, the numbers are pretty high. I mean, basically about 2/3 or more than 2/3 of the population, working population, are satisfied or very satisfied with their jobs. Is it for me to judge whether you should be satisfied? If I were, I don't know. I mean, the UPS man is trotting up to my door as we speak. He looks happy. UPS pays decent wages. Would I be happy? I don't know. My back might ache after a couple days on the job. But I guess the question is, in what kind of society, with what kind of political and economic system are people given a greater choice among occupations? And if you look back through history, basically, we've been on this march towards more freedom, obviously using Milton Friedman's word, freedom to choose what sort of jobs. Back in the old days, the simpler times, if your father was a blacksmith, you would be a blacksmith, and your forefather was a blacksmith. And the same is true of various vocations. I mean, we all know that the reason why families might have the surname Smith is because their entire family going back 1,000 years in Europe were Smiths and blacksmiths. So, we now no longer have those constraints, and I think that gives us greater opportunity for creativity, even if it turns out that there are discontented people, legitimately, who can't quite figure out how to do it. They want to, look, I live in Southern California, and they say every cab driver here has a screenplay in his trunk. He doesn't want to be driving a cab. He wants Steven Spielberg to call him up for a meeting. Yep. Probably not going to happen. But is there another society, another form of economic matter that can make that more likely? I don't really think so.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, what constraints, if any, do we want to put on those choices? And my impulse is to say none. But obviously,
well, and we could look. And I'm sure you have with other guests, because I'm flattered to be on the program because you've interviewed so many brilliant people. But I'm sure you've gotten into the discussion of excessive licensing and the fact that if somebody wants to set up a business of selling tickets to a professional wrestling event. I think I point out in the book they need a license in New York to sell tickets to a pro wrestling. I mean, think about it. This is something that's entirely fake. It's not real wrestling. It's pro wrestling, and they have to get an authentic government license to do it.
That's to keep quality high. That's to make sure that the quality of the person, that the person's professionally trained to sell those fake tickets.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure that Andre the Giant really was a giant, because they don't want to have some midget coming in there in wrestling. They want to make sure that he was measured in a full 7 feet something tall. So obviously we still have quite a number of restraints, and they tend to be put there by government. And as your listeners know, they're put there because entrenched interests like to tamp down competition.
Yeah. Let's talk about the people who love their work, which would include me, and I suspect include you, or at least like your work a lot of the time. And I view that as a great blessing. I look at the history of humanity, and of course, as you point out in the book, there was a lot of romance about primitive man that was, I think, false. Margaret Mead and others who romanticized primitive life as idyllic, I think, were wrong. Primitive man struggles to find enough to eat and doesn't spend a lot of time sitting around the campfire singing folk songs on an improvised guitar, which they wouldn't have either. But so I'm very grateful that I live in a time where I enjoy going to work, and it's a wonderful thing. There is a tendency, I want to come to your subtitle, though. I think the fascinating question for me is that rat race. Early in the book, you say, stress is good for you, retiring makes you stupid, and the hardest working people are not the downtrodden, but those who cannot afford more vacations. So let's talk about the people who work through the weekend, compulsively check their email, never really want to come down, enjoy the fact that they're always connected to the office. We know people who go on vacation and brag about the fact that they choose somewhere where they couldn't get email, but I know a lot of people who don't like that. They want to be connected all the time. Do you think that's good for you, really?
I don't think it's good for everyone. I don't think people should feel plugged in, or an obligation to feel plugged in 24/7. I've had house guests. Their friends were here for a weekend. Saturday morning, I come downstairs, and there they are at my kitchen table, both of them, in tent and with their laptops open.
Sure.
And these were house guests. We thought we would be having fun. I said, what are you doing? They looked at me, surly looks, and said, we're working.
Yeah. We're expressing ourselves.
Yes.
We're being creative. It's good.
Exactly. And in fact, they were in creative industries. So, look, I don't think everyone should be a, quote, type A raging personality. On the other hand, I don't think people should be made to feel guilty for the fact that they're trying to get ahead, trying to make a better lives for their kids and for themselves. But we also have to recognize that sometimes those type A's do a lot of good for the world. In Rush, I tell the story of my father had a heart attack while on vacation in Phoenix. Maybe if he'd stayed at his desk, he would have been fine. But he went on vacation in Phoenix. He had a heart attack.
Vacation can be very stressful.
Yeah,
you got to feel like you got to get all the sights in. You got to get the golf, and then the museum, and then the right kind of dinner. And some people do get stressed out.
Let me tell you, I spent my morning trying to get hotel reservations for Florence, Italy, and it took a lot of effort.
My heart goes out to you, Todd.
Yeah. So anyway, so my father is going to have heart surgery. So my mother was there. I and my brother flew to Phoenix, and there were two doctors to choose between, two surgeons, and one of them was a really nice guy. I'd love to go to dinner with him. He was, conversational and laid back, and the other one looked and acted like he was, Tom Cruise in Top Gun.
King of the universe.
He might as well have been wearing a bomber jacket. But it turned out this is the guy who does more bypasses, and apparently more effectively. And he wasn't a guy I wanted to go out and have a beer with, but this was a real professional, a Top Gun. And, when it's your father who's tethered to the IV tubes, who do you want? The one who'd be a good conversationalist you want to go on vacation with, or the guy who really is intensely focused on his work? And so, we chose the Top Gun. Happily, my father survived the procedure. I think we've got people who are probably too intense by my judgment or your judgment, but often they're intense in a way that ultimately creates benefits and positive externalities, as we'd say.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the question is...
I think Steve Jobs is probably a pretty intense guy.
Yeah, he
wears his black turtleneck or his black shirts and so on, but he seems pretty intense to me, and I have to tell you, I'm absolutely delighted with the iPads and iPhones that I bought in the last few years.
Yeah, and I think he's a good example. He seems to be a pretty demanding fellow and has strong taste, right? Which he's not an easy come, easy go guy probably to work with, and most of us are the beneficiaries of that process. Yeah. And even if you don't like Apple, you're the beneficiary because it's encouraged competition, tried to forced other competitors to meet their standards.
Well, and it's funny. I've got three daughters, and I said something to one of my daughters the other day. I said, if you're a guest at somebody's house, or if you're with other people, friends, going out to dinner and so on, and they ask you, hey, Todd, what are you in the mood for? What sort of food are you in the mood for? If I say, I don't care, whatever you want, I sort of think, I'm being really helpful and I'm not being an obstacle to what they wanted. And I've decided, people actually like to hear some opinion in some direction. There's nothing worse than, a few couples wandering down the lane because they can't decide what they want or, what they want, or no one seems to have any preferences. Sometimes preferences are a good thing.
No, for sure.
And we need them. And so, Steve Jobs is the guy who had a preference for no buttons on computers and screens, and it turns out that's revolutionized how people are doing business and leading their electronic lives these days.
No, for sure. You spend a reasonable amount of time in the book, reasonable meaning fairly long amount of time, is a better way to say it, talking about the evolutionary past that we've inherited and how that imposes constraints on what makes us happy and what we get pleasure from. Talk about what the implications are for, say, competition and stress and happiness.
Yes, well, we are not sloths. Most of us, at least, are not sloths. We wouldn't be happy just, clinging to a branch. As Mary Poppins said to one of her wards, we are not codfish, close your mouth. We are human beings and we've evolved in certain ways. And two of the important ways from a biological point of view and a neuroscience point of view. Number one, we have this large frontal cortex that literally sits in the front of our brains. And it is our window to the future. It is the part of the brain that allows us to imagine the future, to think forward. It's like our windshield as we go forward. And it rewards us for planning, which is very different from the planning that, a beaver does to build a dam. That's more instinctual and so on. But, we can imagine, should it be a dam made out of sticks or woods or metals or, any other, we can do this sort of planning. Number two, we've got these neurotransmitters, and most people have heard of dopamine, for instance, and dopamine is that neurotransmitter that gives us a rush, if you will, that gives us a surge of good feelings when we take a risk, when we try something new. And so my argument in Rush is that our brains have evolved in such a way that we are more likely to get good feelings when we move forward as opposed to just staying in place. That's the frontal cortex. And it's the dopamine, because dopamine is not the juice, the good feeling you get from winning the race. It is the good feeling you get from being involved in something, from being engaged. Once you win the race, it's over. But the real question, or the real challenge in life, I find, and my research shows me, is that it's when people feel engaged and feel as if the future is in front of them and they're moving forward, and that's when they're most likely to get those slivers of happiness. Now, in Rush, I don't promise by reading, the 300 pages, you're suddenly going to feel ecstatic about yourself, but I don't think there's any book that can make you feel that way. I think we should feel lucky. We're privileged that we can grab slivers of happiness now and then. But I don't believe in any yoga master who tells you that, if you meditate, you're going to feel good every day or most of the day. The good feelings we get are when we're acting, not when we're just sitting on our fannies.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. I think it's there's a certain paradox there, of course, that we all live through, especially when we do creative work. There is no doubt that the exhilaration of the process is just spectacular. When you're writing the book, when you're imagining how it'll come out, it's more exciting than the actual book. Not because the book's mediocre or disappointing, just that it's done. And we feel that, I think, as a teacher, I always find the end of the semester, the end of the year, a very bittersweet time. There's an incredible sadness when college ends, whether it's the year or the degree or the time of students here. And it's the same phenomenon, right? That when it's the promise, the expectation, there's an incredible, poignant, and exhilarating feeling that comes from the uncertainty and that risk-taking you're talking about. So we have a certain schizophrenia, right? We know that the payoff is often, it's not disappointing, but when it's over, it's going to be kind of a little bit of a downer.
Yeah.
And yet we keep striving.
Yes. In Rush, I quote, of all people, Frankie Valli, because I was lucky enough to be an angel investor, and I'm listed as one of the co-producers of Jersey Boys, the Broadway Tony Award-winning smash hit. Anyway, in that show,
Congrats.
At the end, Frankie Valli has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he's sold millions of records and, household name and all of that. And after conquering, the music world, Frankie Valli reminisces about success. He says, quote, "They ask you, what was the high point? The Hall of Fame, selling all those records, pulling the song Sherry out of the hat? It was all great. But 4 guys under a street lamp when it was all still ahead of us," unquote. That was the sweetest moment. To imagine the future is an evolutionary gift. And we're the beneficiaries of that gift. And yeah, I agree. The actual, finishing of the task or the accomplishment, all right, you take the bow, you walk off stage, but that's not as thrilling as when you're walking on stage.
Yeah, or as you say, when it's just a glimmer in that Frankie Valli story, and that's a beautiful story, right? He may have been, who knows if he was telling the truth, but I think we all, anytime you've done anything, whether it's remodel your house, change your wardrobe, doesn't matter what it is, the imagining of it is a huge part of the pleasure you get.
Yeah. Well, I read, I don't know whether you did, one of the best sports autobiographies I've ever read was Andre Agassi's book, Open.
Great
right?
book. Great
In
book.
which, which he confesses at one point he said, I hate tennis. And one reason he hates it is that, it's a lonely game and his father beat him into it.
Yep.
And as I read that book, and I think I'd read it right before Tiger Woods had his, marital escapades, I thought, wow, Tiger Woods, he probably hates golf. Now, there he is. He's always, at this point, He's almost always winning. Kind of a lonely sport, all these people following along. But what does he at this point, what's in it for him? To fly all around the world and then have to play golf once again before all these people? I can't imagine that's nearly as fun or interesting or stimulating for him as it was, 5 or 10 years ago when all that greatness was still in front of him.
Yeah, watch his face when he won his, when he's en route to winning his first Masters, and watch it later on in his career. I think what sustained him actually, as long as he was successful, was the expectation, unrealized expectation, that he would pass Jack Nicklaus in success in majors or some other measure, and that kept him going. I think, as you say, he was getting. You could imagine it wasn't quite as interesting. It does raise the interesting question whether he's happier now. I doubt it, but he's got other things going on at the same time.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you.
He's got a more interesting golf life, that's for sure.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I mean, now that his wife has taken up the game by slapping him across the head or across his window. It's interesting. It occurs to me, as someone who sees a lot of theater, and I've actually written a play. It's not been produced yet. Maybe it will someday. One of the most common complaints about a theatrical piece is, quote, it fell apart or it didn't have a second act.
Yep.
People, when they're disappointed in a play, it's usually not because the first act wasn't good, because the first act is the build-up, right? It's the second of how things are resolved. It kind of became boring at that point. Yeah, and I think that sort of reflects the fact that we like, look, nothing gets people to lean forward in their seats more than if someone says, hey, let me tell you a story, right? Just that phrase, let me tell you a story, that's the promise of something in front of you. How the story ends, okay, maybe it'll end with a big belly laugh, but what gets us going is, let me tell you, come with me. That's much more exciting than here it is.
Well, that's a great example, and I think, digressing for a moment onto Broadway, most second acts aren't as good as the first act, and it's obviously a challenge. I never thought about the challenge being the realizing of the expectations or the end of the uncertainty about how the future would unfold. One of my favorite shows is Wicked, and the first act of Wicked ends with the best song in the show, which is Defying Gravity, and the best moment in the show. And I remember when the first act ended, the first time I saw it, I said to my wife, let's go home. That was great. And now the second act's actually pretty good, but it's not as good as the first act. And I mean, it's a great show. I didn't leave disappointed or anything, but you're right that the expectation of what comes next is really much easier than resolving it in a way that's satisfying. And it is. I never thought about it as having an evolutionary component that our brains, we like the future. We really do.
It's funny. Daniel Gilbert, who's the Harvard psychologist, with whom I disagree from time to time in my book, does point out something that's interesting observation. And I suppose it is true that people tend not to watch DVR'd or videotaped sporting events even if they don't know the outcome. In other words, if they say, hey, I'm a big Bears fan, the Bears are playing, the Lions, I'm not going to read the paper or listen to the radio, but I'm going to watch it. He said they tend not to because somehow they have this feeling that it's already taken place, they're rooting for their team, isn't going to have any impact through God or some other, brainwave.
Mystical, yeah.
Yeah, and so they end up not doing that. Now, I don't know whether that's, empirically true, but it's an interesting observation. I think it does sort of reflect the fact that, we like to march forward, not just, play nostalgia.
Well, I'm going to disagree with that. He's not here to defend himself, but I think I've watched a lot of sporting events taped because I couldn't watch them live. And I think the reason it's probably dying out now simply because it's almost impossible to keep yourself in what we used to call radio silence, where people wouldn't tell you who won, or you don't get a tweet, or an instant message about it. But I do think what's interesting that both I think contradicts that point and reinforces your earlier point is that I'll watch Wicked. I've seen it, I think, 3 times, or I think 2 or 3 times. My wife's seen it 3 times.
I've really got to get you to see Jersey Boys.
I've not seen it. I'm open to it. I can't. I take no gifts, Todd, but I would like to see it. But Wicked is a great show, and I enjoyed it as much the second time, even though I knew what was going to happen. And we do have a right. That's the ultimate taped sporting event. I saw Cyrano de Bergerac last night, actually, and I know how it ends.
Yes.
I've seen it, and it doesn't make it any. I still love it. It's still powerful, and
well, you know what? I do agree with you. I mean, I quote Gilbert in the book, but look, the whole concept of the classic ESPN's Classic Sports Channel.
Correct.
I'll watch a boxing match, an old Muhammad Ali boxing match again. I mean, I was at the Stratford Festival just attending a couple weeks ago with my kids in Canada, and we saw Richard III, and you know what? He doesn't make it.
Yeah, hey, don't spoil it.
Yes, exactly.
Spoiler warning.
Yes.
It's a bad outcome for Richard III. He doesn't get a horse. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
missing a horse.
Yes, maybe if he had an iPad, he wouldn't have needed a horse.
Yeah, but I do. The part that I think is fascinating that I'd never thought of is this: when we watch a show the second time, or we rewatch a classic sporting event, we suspend our disbelief, even though we know how it's going to come out. We put ourselves back in that moment, and I think we savor that kind of possibility that when things are possible, and we love that. It's very much part of what makes us human.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I also talk about performing artists performing live. And I talk about Frank Sinatra confessing he still got butterflies on stage, even later in his career, because it's the excitement. And he felt that, it made him sing better.
Yeah, Bill Russell.
When I was a kid, and maybe you remember, there were those old ads for Memorex tapes with Ella Fitzgerald, right? Is it live or is it Memorex?
Crack in the glass.
Yes, and there's something thrilling about that, because there's the stress, and that gets back to the issue of stress in society, and my argument that actually, we need stress. Otherwise, we become too complacent and bored and discontent.
Yeah, Bill Russell, who has, I think, 11 championship rings as a Boston Celtic, he threw up before every game out of anxiety, supposedly. He's clearly a top 10 player, maybe top 5 player all time.
Sure.
And it wasn't easy for him. And as you say, I think he used that deliberately to make himself a better player. I don't think he ever wanted to be complacent or content about it.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's better to throw up before the game than to get beaten by Bill Russell and be sick for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, or during. Now, let's talk about the rat race. You do at the end of the book have some. I'm not sure I'd call them caveats, but obviously some people consumed by competition, type A or whatever you want to call it, lose connections to their friends and family. And I think so many of the critics of our modern, I love when people say our modern lifestyle, as if there were one. But let's talk about the people who do work very hard. Obviously, it comes at a price sometimes that they regret. So you're not suggesting that you should neglect friends and family and merely pursue the future, right?
No. I think a balanced life makes sense, but I also find that the great bonding experience in our lives, in our personal lives, not our work lives, tend to be those involved with action. Now look, we just spoke about theater, and it's fun to take your kids and go to the theater, but it's more fun for them if you are doing something other than passively sitting there. And those are the sorts of things that make relationships. Those are the sort of things that create experiences that make us happy. I took my kid. I'm not an ardent whitewater rafter by any means, but we were on vacation, and I took my daughters rafting, and it was. I wouldn't say it was the experience of a lifetime, but it was a much greater experience than if we watched a really good movie about whitewater rafting.
For sure.
So my argument is that no, you shouldn't be working 24/7 and ignoring your family, but the time you spend with your family shouldn't be, simply defined as downtime. it should be defined in a way that you're creating experiences. And it's tough to create experiences if you're just kind of sitting on a chair reading the newspaper while your kids are, on the other side of the room, lounging in their own sphere.
That's always an interesting challenge on vacation. Everybody has different philosophies of what they do, right? Some people just want to sit on the beach and they're happy reading next to their spouse and their kids and let the kids splash in the water a little bit. And other people want to be out doing that stuff, whitewater rafting and parasailing and doing everything.
And look, again, I've got hyperactive friends who can't stop, jumping around in the water. And sometimes I look at them and say, oh, God, I wish I had the energy, to play with the kids as vigorously as Eric does, because the guy won't sleep. So I'm not prescribing this as someone says, hey, do what I do. I'm not perfect in that respect. But again, it's about building experiences, because those are the sorts of things that we remember, and those are the sorts of things that bring us good feelings.
Let's talk about the people on the other side of the political spectrum, or people who would want to restrain some of these choices that we make. And as we both agree, some people choose to be more active than others. Some people choose to be more competitive than others. Some people choose to be more materialistic. And I love that everybody has the freedom in our country, at least mostly, to choose those options. Why do you think, though, that there are so many people who are selling intellectually a different flavor, who want to restrain our choices, who argue that these natural, whether they're natural or not, and you argue in the book that these are natural impulses that we have to take into account if we want to be happy and lead satisfied lives, and I agree with you. But why is it then that it's so easy for them to sell that return to Eden philosophy, the Walden Pond, as if Thoreau sat around all day on his rear end at Walden? He is, I think you point out, he was pretty active. He was an active guy. He didn't sit around and look off in the distance for most of his life. Why is that viewpoint so nostalgic? Why is that nostalgic view so attractive to so many people?
Well, and by the way, the sellers of that idea, they work awfully hard at it, don't they? I mean, Deepak Chopra and all the others, they've got their institutes, they've got their expensive spas, they've got their PBS specials. They're working, they're marketing it all the time. I think that there is this natural, primitive yearning, as we said at the beginning, a yearning for paradise that calls upon people. And look, I quoted earlier that most people are satisfied or very satisfied with their jobs. At the same time, many people feel underappreciated, and this is especially true of the intelligentsia. The English professor in his office is looking around saying, my dumb C-plus student, just became CEO of Lehman Brothers or President of the United States. Yep. And so, why should we have this system that that neither rewards people based on moral merit, nor does it seem to reward them on intelligence? Because if it did, I, the tenured English professor, would be paid far more than any of my students. So, and this has been the attraction of a socialist apparatus, for at least 100 years, and that's why its support tends to come from the underappreciated intelligentsia, rather than from the middle classes or the rabble.
Of course, it's a strange thing though, because many economists hold this Edenistic view, have a nostalgia for the past, and they're making a lot more than that English professor. They're paid very, very well these days, right? A PhD in economics is a pretty lucrative gig, and it's interesting to me that they still are selling a return to simplicity.
Well, I suppose that's right. I'm not sure. See, here's what I think the disconnect is, where there's a logical fallacy and a leap that is a treacherous leap, like, Evel Knievel trying to go over whatever that canyon was. It's one thing to look at your friend, let's just call your friend Bob. You look at your friend Bob and say, Bob is under a lot of stress. Bob, he didn't get the promotion he was looking for. He's got a big mortgage. He may have trouble making the payments, so on and so forth. He really needs some time out to turn down the dial on stress. And we know people like that. Yep. And for Bob, that really would probably be a good prescription. We got to figure out how to get Bob out of this terribly stressful situation. But the logical or illogical leap that's then made is people will say, therefore, our society needs to just take a Ambien or a Xanax, and we need to unplug capitalism and unplug free enterprise because that's what's creating Bob's situation. So what might be a good prescription for Bob the individual, I think would be a hazardous prescription on a macro basis, and that's what I find so many of these practitioners doing. Saying if we could just, unplug competition, we'd all be better off. And what they fail to realize is every society has competition. You don't think the Soviet Union had competition? China, in Maoist China had competition, but it wasn't competition to see who could patent the next prostate cancer drug. It was competition to see who could get the party boss to get them a cold shower once a week. Yeah. So they were vying for what scraps were on the table as opposed to trying to, build a new kind of world. So the competition is there and the stress is there. The question is whether you want to channel it in a way that leads to longer lifespans and a better standard of living, or you want to channel it so that everyone is engaged in, a zero-sum game of grabbing the remaining scraps on the table.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I do think some of those differences come down to Thomas Sowell's great thesis, The Conflict of Visions. Some people see, Sowell says there are people who take what we would call a Smithian realistic view or a more utopian view of human nature. And what you're saying is, which I think is true, is that this is the way we are. So suggest we should try to stop that is just simply unrealistic.
Well, yes, look, and I'm sure you found the same as you've traveled in your career, and I've been lucky enough at various times to be associated with the White House and Harvard and all sorts of august institutions, and I always thought I'm going to find Mozart at one of these places. And it turns out in my career I've never found a Mozart. The Mozart of economics or the Mozart of politics or the Mozart of, writing theatrical works. I mean, what I find is we got a lot of Salieri's out there, trying to pluck out a reasonable tune, and that's probably, good enough. And the concept that there's Eden or there's Mozart or there's this, this saintly person, if we could just follow in his footsteps, he's not competitive at all. The more honest biographies you read of great men, and most recently, new biography of Mahatma Gandhi, you find out that, what do you know? Humans are humans. And so we've got to take people as they are, not as we would like to recreate them.
Talk about trust. What's your view on, you talk about the role of how trust and competition interact. What role does that play in our economy?
Well, yes, trust plays, of course, a huge role. And my argument is that a few things. Number one, societies, as they become more private enterprise focused, more commercial, the more trade, the more trust there is. And there's some studies that have recently been done that are noted in Rush that show that basically, if you go back to, or if you go down to South America, you go to more primitive tribes in, Southeast Asia and elsewhere, if you can still find Aboriginal tribes, and people assume, the Margaret Mead types and their progeny will tell us, they're more honest, and so it turns out their murder rates are higher, their theft rates are higher, and so on. The more, quote, advanced civilizations or countries tend to have lower crime rates, and crime rates have fallen dramatically in Europe over the last 500, 1,000 years. So, first of all, the trust and the honesty seems to be developed and enhanced by commercial transactions. And secondly, it is not the first transaction, it's the repeat transaction. In other words, you can be ripped off easily by some fly-by-night salesman. I mean, that's the whole point. A fly-by-night salesman, obviously a pejorative term. It means he's only going to be there for one transaction, then he's gone. Well, he's got no reason to engender trust with you except to fool you for that one transaction. But if he's got a storefront, and as 90% of businesses need to make money on repeat customers, not stealing or ripping off one customer and then moving on to the next, he's got to be honest in his transactions. So, so what you need is a society where people trade and a society where they have an expectation that the strangers they trade with will be a more permanent part, of their environment. And that's, and by the way, I guess 15 years ago, you might have objected and say, hey, but what about all these internet transactions? That's not my storefront. That guy's not down the street from me. But now we've had the advent of TripAdvisor and the Amazon star system and eBay star system. So now we've got ingenious systems so that people who are strangers somewhere out in cyberspace actually become much closer than strangers, and in some cases, you may feel closer to them than you do to the guy who's got the storefront a couple blocks from your house,
or even a family member if it's the wrong kind of family member. Yeah.
Well, yes, we all have, some family member that we'd rather not trust much money with.
Well, no, I use the example of if I have to get to the airport at a certain time, do I want to call my brother or do I want to call a stranger I'm going to pay? And in my case, my brother's remarkably reliable, and I'd be totally happy with my brother. But I'm sure.
Well, listen, I'm flying into Dulles next week. Give me your brother's number.
There you go. Well, but that's of course part of the point is that I only have one brother who I can count on, and my sister's pretty reliable too. But I'm sure many people out there have siblings that probably better off calling the cab. Or the shuttle.
Well, that's right. And again, another argument or part of the book, I argue that charity obviously is a good thing, and I encourage my kids and my wife and I try to be as charitable as we know how. But can you build a society entirely on charity? I don't think so. And I point out, and this really reflects, Hayek's, great essay on information. If we're out together and you say, hey, Todd, I like your tie. I say, here, take my tie. You can have it. Oh, and you say, well, can I pay? No, it's charity, and maybe you'll give me your tie instead and we've swapped. But that doesn't, then we've got some questions to ask. Well, what materials went into that tie? How much silk? How much polyester? How many resources were used to make it? If we don't somehow have an ability to put a price on something, we end up wasting precious natural resources instead of, handling them in a way to preserve them or put some value on them. So ultimately, even a society based on just everybody sharing ends up being a very wasteful society with some very big open questions to be answered.
No, you have to know what to produce. And that article is, of course, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which we probably mention about every 2 or 3 months. It's being one of my favorite articles. So we'll put a link up to it one more time, folks, out there. If you haven't read it yet, this is a good time to read it. It's a great article. It's where Hayek calls the price system a marvel. And I think he was onto something there. And obviously,
and for someone to write so brilliantly and so clearly in what was not even his first language is just a staggering thought.
Well, I think that was the exception, maybe rather than the rule. He's not always the most light and intrepid stylist, but in that article, he's pretty clear. I will agree with you. It's an amazing thing, actually. His essays are really well written. I think they're much easier to read than his books. I don't know why, but maybe some Hayekian out there can tell us.
Well, I had a conversation with a friend the other day who said a similar thing about Keynes, whom I always thought Keynes is a very clear writer. I mean, you might obviously disagree with many of his views and arguments, but I always thought he was a skillful writer. But my friend insisted, no, it's only his essays that are well written.
His essays are very well written. His books, the general theory is very painful to try to read, especially today. I don't know if it was easier then.
Well, given the bogus fiscal stimulus plan we had out of Washington 2 years ago, I wouldn't recommend reading the general theory again at this moment.
Unfortunately, it's always timely. It's always going to be something that people want to use to justify spending. Actually, we're almost out of time. Let's come to an essay of Keynes that's relevant for your thesis. And some of your discussion reminded me of it. He has a famous essay where he talks about the economic future. And his theme in that essay is that this was written, I think, in the late 20s or mid 30s. And he says there's going to be a time in the future when we're going to have an extraordinary standard of living. And we're going to have our biggest challenge is going to be leisure. What are we going to do with all the extra time? And, he was half right. He was right that an extraordinary standard of living was coming. He was wrong that our problem was going to be leisure because we still manage to work hard. We don't sit around and say, I've got plenty. But Keynes very much pushed in that essay, and I think probably affected his theorizing elsewhere. He was very anti-saving. He did not like looking to the future. He viewed it as, in many ways, and if you read the essay, and again, I will try to put a link up to it, he viewed it as a moral failing to look to the future. And your book reminds us that we are future-oriented, whether we like it or not. Keynes didn't like it, perhaps, but it's perhaps the way we are.
Well, and it's interesting because his teacher, Alfred Marshall, at Cambridge, was someone who embraced savings and deemed interest rates and so on as the reward for patience. And not medical patience, but being patient about things.
Yeah.
And then I'm reminded, Schumpeter in his essay also suggested that, or his book on capitalism and socialism suggested that, ultimately socialism wins. Why? Because the sons and daughters of affluent people will have too much time on their hands and decide, in all of their luxury to plot the end of competition. And I think that's, I think Schumpeter kind of points to those moralists and economists today who had the luxury, because look, let me put it more simply. 200 years ago, when people were struggling just to get enough food not to starve to death, they didn't have time to sit around wondering, gosh, are we under too much stress? So the stress that we feel is a luxury. The idea of talking about stress today is a luxury, a result of the fact that we've created this high standard of living. But again, is now the time to say game over? Let's just put everything in a lockbox. For all we know, 1 year from now, there'll be a cure for lung cancer, and maybe if we unplug the pharmaceutical industry today, that won't come about, and thousands will die. And I'd rather take the chance and keep going than pronounce that this is the final moment that we should embrace and just keep us in the status quo.
I think the people who are on the other side, who want a more controlled life from top down, or who want a less dynamic, more egalitarian world, their argument, I think, is that we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. The improvements in health that are coming are relatively small, and I'd say, boy, the jury's not out on that one yet. Who knows? Well,
I don't believe the jury is out, and it's really amazing. Just in the last 20 years, the changes in life expectancy as a result of cardiac medicine and cardiac procedures. It's not a couple of weeks. It's years of gains just having taken place. During recent decades.
And then you get your artificial knees, and you can keep playing tennis, and right. It's not just you're sitting around in an armchair drooling. The quality of life is better too. It's so much more than just life expectancy being longer, people living longer.
Well, exactly. And frankly, I'm impressed at the number of senior citizens, I include my mother among this, so engaged in the internet. Of course, half of her engagement is sending urban myths to me.
With alarm, no doubt.
Yes,
saying, yes.
Careful. Yes, don't put that mug of water in the microwave or the entire world will explode. So some of the technological and other benefits we're seeing are not merely redounding to, Silicon Valley nerds and 20-somethings. They're redounding to the benefit and the lives of, people across many spectra across the world and across almost all age groups.
My guest today has been Todd Buchholz. Todd, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.